Hugh Crutwell, who was the principal of RADA, said to me when I left, you'll make a good character actor when you're 40, Jonathan. Many years later, I was at a dinner party and found myself sitting next to Hugh, and he said, do you remember what I said? And I said, do you think I could ever forget that? And he said, yeah, I was right, wasn't I? The only thing I got wrong was that I didn't know the character was going to be Jonathan Meades.
Jonathan Meades. Restaurant critic. Ex. Social historian. Cultural historian.
Don't make that.
Journalist.
Yeah, that'll
author.
Do. That'll do.
Television performer.
Yeah.
Which one is you? Which one is nearest to you?
None of them. They're all fabrications. I mean, very idea of you as a fabrication, or me as a fabrication.
Hang on, this is getting very philosophical.
It's not philosophical at all. It's just evasive.
So, I mean, when you started off writing, did you ever think that you could actually earn a living by writing about the sort of things you have written about?
I was very grateful to get published, and I liked getting paid, but I thought, no, I doubt it. I think it's rash to think that you can make a living out of something you actually like doing.
So, but did you ever at any point in your sort of early career think, actually, there is money to be made from writing about food?
No, because in my early career there was very little writing about food in Britain. I did enter the competition which Faye Mashler won in 1972, which was the second year in which I'd been writing professionally. I didn't win it, obviously. Faye won it. I was mentioned by Simon Jenkins, of all people, who I think was the features editor of the Times, and said I put myself through it by eating offal to find something to write about. Anyway, the only other I taught myself to cook by reading Mastering the Art of French Cooking. I mean, you couldn't teach yourself to cook by reading Elizabeth David, because that presumes a kind of knowledge, and the knowledge to realise that a lot of recipes are terribly mistaken. But I did assiduously put myself through Mastering the Art of French Cooking.
I find there's a sort of curious synergy between our lives, because when researching this, I discovered that we are in fact born 8 days apart, and you're 8 days older than I am. I shall now treat you with considerable respect as a consequence. Yes. I also learned to cook from Mastering the Art of French Cookery, which I still regard as probably the finest pure cookery book.
Yes, it's great. It's a great primer. I mean, but I did it with an absolutely dogged literality. I mean,
well, that's what you do. I mean, that's what
you didn't mess. You accepted that this was the way to do it and did it. One of the important things I learned at RADA was the importance of technique and craft, and that has seemed to impinge on the way that I've treated everything else, because it's absolutely drummed into you there. You had to be pretty good to get in, or you had to have a certain competence, or be able to dissemble your uselessness, which is of course acting. I liked it. It was a bit like, it was very odd at that period, being in a place which was so disciplined, because in art schools they would just tell you to, get on with it, darling, express yourself. There was none of that, rather. I mean, it was a Sandhurst for chorus boys. And
highly disciplined.
Extremely disciplined. And if you're reasonably receptive, a lot of that's going to rub off.
As disciplines for later in life.
Yeah.
But you turned out not, you decided you weren't going to be an actor.
I didn't think I was good enough.
And so rather than doing sort of 20 years of resting until you became a character actor, you then moved into journalism and became...
Yeah, the first journalism I did was literary journalism for quite a lot. I mean, I worked for Books and Bookmen who would let you write whatever you wanted and as much as you wanted, provided it was literate, which was good. And I drifted gradually into writing about architecture and topography and so on, but I still kept on writing a lot of literary criticism, and didn't write about food till the early 80s, when I had the opportunity to become restaurant critic at Tatler, because I was the features editor and took over when Julian Barnes resigned.
And did you feel in any way that your life prior to that had formed your persona as a restaurant critic?
No. I mean, because I didn't expect to be a restaurant critic for very long. I thought I was, filling in, and sure enough, when the new editor of Tatler arrived, Mark Boxer, he didn't like what I wrote, and so I stopped doing it, and I didn't really care. And then about a year later, a curious, expensively produced magazine called A La Carte asked me if I wanted to write about restaurants for it, and I said sure. And again, I mean, it only came out once every 2 months, and I always found it a bit of a struggle to know where to go. And then the Times asked me to take over from Stan Hay, who was essentially a comedy scriptwriter. He wrote, I think it's good, Auf Wiedersehen Pet, and a wonderful series about a sports writer which David Warner played in. It was very good. And Stan was a terrific writer, but he wasn't really interested in food. And the Times was a bit amazed. Richard Williams and Nick Shakespeare, who hired me, they're rather bemused to find out that I was actually interested in the subject rather than using it for something to do gags.
And you were a wonderful writer as well.
Well, I like doing the gags.
But you also clearly liked eating the food.
Yeah, I like both. I prefer writing to eating.
So you started around about mid-1980s writing about restaurant reviews for the Times, is that right?
Summer of '86.
And what was food like? I mean, what were the famous restaurants then?
Nico was quite, I would say, was the Nico and Gavroche. Although I didn't go to the Gavroche later, but Nico I was very impressed by from actually when I'd written about it in Tatler pseudonymously. Nico, I called myself John Beaver after the
Evening War.
After the guy in Handful of Dust, but I don't think I think that passed Nico by. I don't think he was very.
I'm not sure he was terribly up to scratch.
No, but I liked his cooking. Tante Claire was good.
The young Pierre Kaufman.
Yeah, he never seemed very young.
Yes.
So I think it's one of the great things about him.
It was one of Max Beer,
but very soon after I'd started this, and Marco Pierre White opened his first restaurant, the River Cafe opened, Alistair Little opened, Simon Hopkinson opened Bibendum, Rowley Lee opened Kensington Place. And those five between them, those five places and those chefs, well, 6 chefs, of course, there was Ruth and Rose at the River Cafe, I think set the agenda for the next 2 decades, really.
Yeah.
Julian Wickham, who designed Kensington Place, must be sick to see how many times he was ripped off. I mean, that was the model for something which existed up, I would say, well after the new millennium.
Sickened or flattened. But the point wasn't it? It was that generation of restaurants that suddenly opened up fine dining, for want of a better phrase.
Can we find another one? Fine dining.
I can't. That's why I've used it.
Oh, all right.
Well, you find one. Okay.
Okay.
High-end eating out, whatever you like to call it.
Okay.
It was going out for to.
But it wasn't Ponzi.
No, that was the point. That was the point. It de-Ponzified fine dining. It made it accessible. It democratised it to some degree.
It depends what you mean by democratising it.
Well, I think what it was, if you remember, the thing about Kensington Place was that instead of having a sort of cubbyhole of a restaurant, dark and shady with heavy drapes around the place, you had a ceiling to the open window, and people could look in. The eater became become part of the spectator sport for the outside world. And therefore,
maybe I think what Kensington Place was, more than the other places I mentioned, more than the other restaurants I mentioned, was that it was an amalgamation between a chef who had been highly trained and disciplined by the Roux brothers, and people who'd been involved in sort of the Zanzibar clubs and so on, and so there was that
popular culture.
There was that crossover,
yes,
which was not what happened, say, at Bibendum. A different sort of thing, but again, that seemed to me to be extremely influential.
But in a way, what they were different points on the same spectrum. If you
Yes,
see what I mean.
yeah, absolutely.
So that they're offering different sorts of experiences to the discerning eater out, who didn't feel they had to dress up in a black suit and a tie, who feel that they could actually sit in a suit and no tie, or whatever it was. It was that sort of relaxed
kind
view.
of slobbish, I suppose. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
I think I think you might say from.
Tell me about your tattoos.
It's the year. It was the generation of the slob, and there's nothing wrong with that.
No, no. I think that I was very lucky because I was there to witness that. But I have to say,
I think I'm slightly understanding this. You not only witnessed that, but you also gave it a public voice, because you became the most authoritative, the most respected critic in the land at the time.
if I did, I wasn't really aware of it. What I witnessed, maybe. I certainly wasn't a propagandist for it. I mean, I think that if I made... I think there's a point to be made about this generic journalism of this sort, where people call it consumer journalism, but an awful lot of it is not. It's producer journalism. It's taking the side too much of the person who makes whatever is being sold to the public. And I think if I made a mistake, it was to be too interpretative of what these people were doing in the way that, say, Rayner Banham had been of the Smithson's architecture in the 50s. And it's probably too effusive, but on the other hand, I think the first few months I was doing it, the second half of 1986, I thought, God, how on earth can I go on doing this? It's so boring and it's so banal. And the Times was not keen on me doing sort of Turkish holes in the wall in Haringey and places which I'd have gone to eat in of my own volition.
Yeah.
So that was a problem, and suddenly there came along a solution to it. Having said which, after the last of those openings, which was, I think, Kensington Place at the end of '87, there was a dip, and one just found that the same restaurant, those restaurants were getting replicated over and again. They were poor copies, and at this point, I would say probably in '88, I said to the Times I wasn't going to, I was packing up, and they doubled my money.
Very difficult to refuse.
And this happened on several occasions. I mean, whenever I decided to give up, they just paid me more money, which
quite the opposite with the Guardian, by the way.
Really?
Every time I thought they halved it.
Well, no, the Times was rich. It's owned by Mr. Murdoch. But eventually, I thought I was doing it in very, very bad faith.
But don't you think that, in a way, you downplay your own role in this, is that in fact that these places, because they were actually radical in terms of the food culture at the time, they needed a prophet. They needed someone to explain what they were, what their significance was.
I certainly didn't think that I was a
No.
conduit the thoughts and philosophies and ideologies, if should they have had any of these, of these people. I was merely descriptive. I mean, I would hope that I would describe Marco's cooking in such a way that people would get a pretty good idea that there wasn't actually anything terribly like it previously. I'm sure he must have come out of somewhere, but I don't know where. He's pretty much a self-invention, and obviously he came out of the Ruse, but he wasn't cooking like the Ruse.
Continues to be a self-invention.
Yeah, and equally, I got a letter from my aunt in Southampton who said, "Oh, there's a chap doing very nice cooking down by the docks," and this was Novelli, who was cooking in a strange place called Geddes, rather beautifully converted warehouse.
This was before the Provence.
Oh yeah. This was again in early '87, and there, these people were cropping up, doing interesting sort of things.
When you were writing this, did you feel that you had a responsibility to the chefs, and to the restaurateurs, or to the readers?
To the readers,
above all.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes. I mean, it worries me that I may have appeared to have been too much special pleading on behalf of certain chefs. I mean, which is galling in retrospect. I don't think I probably realised that I was doing it at the time.
I think we all have our enthusiasms, and that's a perfectly natural thing to do. But I think that, I do think there's a sort of important aspect here of the responsibility or the role of the restaurant critic. How do you see the role of the restaurant critic? What is their use or function?
I think you're kind of, if you're doing properly, you're entertaining the readership with what you write, because if it's not entertaining, they're not going to read it. And you're also acting as a kind of litmus paper and a consumer guide. And I would hope that it doesn't go much beyond that.
Do you find that when you were writing about restaurants, is that you felt restricted in your vocabulary about just on the technical side of things? I think when the English always have a slightly sort of ambivalent relationship with food. But do you think there are technical difficulties in writing about food? I mean, if you look at the sort of, if you go to the Roger's Thesaurus and look at the sort of descriptive words which are apparently associated with food, they're fewer than the average sports reporter would have at his command.
Yes, this is something I've never really considered. I mean, I didn't set out a sort of plan of how I would write. I mean, I don't in general. I mean, I write whatever comes into my head.
You write the way you like to write.
I write in a way to find out what I'm thinking about something, and it's the way that it's a way into my head for myself.
So each piece is, in a sense, an exploration of your own associations or assessment or reactions to the experience that you just had.
Yeah, and that goes for my writing about other subjects too. So long as if there is a subject. I mean, obviously there's a certain kind of writing for which there isn't a subject, and you're making it up as you go along. But even if I'm writing about a floor tile, I'm trying to work out what that floor tile means to me. In the way that I would with a particular chef, particular dish, particular restaurant interior, and so on.
And does this, in a sense, explain why you became bored in the end? Because, I mean, this is what I think you gave up writing, in the sort of sense of bored in the way of public food and the response that it required from it, or the responses themselves were simply uniform and therefore not worth writing about.
I think that if you're writing 46 columns a year for 15 years, I think that you're bound to, you're bored with the fact that you're repeating yourself. And it's a difficult subject the subject is not broad enough to obviate the possibility of repetition. I mean, you try not to repeat yourself, but I mean, it's kind of inevitable. I'm not suddenly going to find myself liking heavily spiced Indian food. I'm not going to suddenly find myself enjoying restaurants where they play non-stop pop music, etc., etc.
Is it also because there are two things happening here? One is that actually most restaurants are images of each other. I mean, there's a terrible similarity.
Well, sure. I mean, you in any generation of any endeavour, you've got a few goats, and then you've got a bloody great flock of sheep following them along, and that's not just in restaurants, that's in everything.
The other thing about it is that when you go to a restaurant, every time you actually go through an identical experience. You go through the door, you have your cake, you sit down, you order your food, you order your wine, you drink it, you eat it, you pay your bill, and you go. And that is the repeated process every time. How do you make that interesting? Week after week after week.
You just have to be fairly ruseful to do it. But one thing I would say on that subject is that by the time I finished doing it after 15 years, it was taking me half a week to write a column, whereas previously, when I started, it was an afternoon. And it got more and more difficult to think of anything to say which I hadn't said before, and anything to say in which I didn't despair of myself. It just doing this. It was like I'd become a production line turning out the same bar of chocolate, whereas once I had done violet creams and fabulous ganache.
So you gave it up with a sigh of relief.
Yes, I did.
But did it at any point interfere with your pleasure in food, as per se?
No, because my pleasure in food is as much cooking as it is eating.
Are you a good cook?
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, well, Marco was graceful enough to say that I was the best amateur cook he'd ever met. But on the other hand,
a great accolade.
Quid pro quo, mate. Quid pro quo.
Back scratching going on vigorously.
Yes, I think so. I think that's culinary log rolling.
So you gave up food, but you didn't give up your love of food. But you then, my sequence is slightly unclear here. You didn't go to France at more or less the same time.
No. I wrote another column on the Times.
That's
for,
right. You did,
for
yes,
5 years.
Yeah. And then you decided that enough was living in this country was enough, and you went through.
But I wanted to give myself a jolt.
Do you think it's necessary to reinvent yourself in a sense every
Yes.
so often, every 10 years or
absolutely.
so, with a change of job, a change of house, a change of country, whatever it happens to be? What were the attractions of France?
I can speak the language. I mean, it's as simple as that. I mean, French.
But there must be more than that. Therefore, you must have been attracted to the French culture, to the French history, or to French whatever it is to be.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's odd because we first moved to the country quite near Bordeaux, and I have friends in Bordeaux and so on. But we discovered that we didn't like the country. I mean, the country's great if you going through it in a capsule called a car, but once you kind of get out...
You are an urban man, aren't you?
Well, we then moved to Marseille, and you don't get much more urban than Marseille, which is great. I mean, Marseille is to France what Liverpool is to England.
But is it towns as sort of social constructs, or is it towns as architectural exhibitions, as it were?
Both. I mean, my new book is called Museum Without Walls, and the Museum Without Walls is the city. Not I don't mean the city. I don't mean London. I don't mean the city of London. I mean
the notion of a city.
The notion of a city, and the sheer pleasure that you glean from just looking at what mankind has made around you.
But I want to come back to, in a sense, the attraction, because I think that towns have also, I mean, urban areas, I don't mean towns and cities, they have the ability both to delight and to drive you to despair. And it always strikes me, one of the things about architecture per se, or the architecture itself, is that it is the most public form of art. You cannot, sculptures, paintings, installations, whatever they have to be, can be tucked away inside a pub. You have a building, it's on there for people to react to, irrespective of it, and therefore it has a particular responsibility to the society in which it is a part.
Indeed, it does, and I think it's a responsibility which a lot of architects don't recognise. I think equally a lot of architects seem to think that cities are made just by architecture, and they have that kind of arrogance, and it's like kind of utopianism. They think that they can make the world a better place with concrete and glass, or bricks and wood, or whatever it happens to be. They can't, and cities are determined almost as much by what goes against the grain of the architecture as by the architecture itself. I mean, a place is not made by buildings. There's spaces in between buildings and things that people do to buildings. And St. Catherine's College, Oxford, which Arne Jacobsen designed, and Jacobsen happened to be came back to the college and was infuriated by the fact that people had stuck things on the walls. And he wanted his vision to be immaculate. And this is a very, very common problem with architects. They can't let go of the building to allow people to do what they want in it. And people will do what they want in it. And that
is a healthy thing.
Yes, absolutely. And that collision between an architect's ego and the casual will of the people using the building is what makes places interesting. The impure is always much more interesting than the pure. There's no purity. It's like virginity. I mean, what's it for?
But it's sort of interesting this because in a way that I don't think one can possibly compare great chefs, great architects with it. But there is about great chefs. There's a sense of also that purity of the creation of the dish, which is clearly a view which you have even less truck with than you do of a building which should never be tampered with by the people who live in it.
Yes, I mean. You get the dish. I mean, I switched on the telly last night, and you'll have to tell me what the guy's called. He's called Thomas someone. He's got the restaurant called the French Laundry.
Oh, Thomas Keller.
That's right.
Yes.
And he was talking about, he was showing some dish which there must have been sort of 20 people putting their dirty fingers all over the bits, sort of rearranging it like. It's rather like one of those kind of dresses you used to see on Come Dancing, where the sequins were sewn on by her taxi driver father, and there are 8,000 of them. There lots of this sort of prissy, unhygienic cooking going on, and then a bit of gelatine, sort of, which looked really like a kind of used condom over the top of it, and this guy talking about how the shapes on the plate, as well as the flavour, express the chef's personality. God, where do you go with people like this? What can be done about them?
Do I take it that you're not wholly in sympathy with some of the trends of modern cooking?
No, I'm wholly in sympathy with the trends of a kind of large portion of cassoulet.
Yeah, but surely aren't these simply, they're different forms of experience?
Gore Vidal said, art should always be different, craft should always be the same. And I kind of go along with that with cooking. I don't like inventive and experimental cooking, because it seems to me that humankind has kind of got it right down the centuries, and sure, there are going to be kind of adjustments. Bocuse said, you know, a chef is lucky if he thinks up one new recipe in his life. You know, tell that to Heston bloody whatever he's called, Blumenthal, and all these very, and obviously food is going to change down the years, but the self-conscious desire to renovate food, to renew it, to change it for the sake of change is something that seems particularly uninteresting to me, and pretentious, and also loses sight of the fact that food is for feeding.
But hang on, Jonathan, I mean, I don't think this is entirely rational.
There's nothing rational about this. It's
visceral.
A
gut reaction.
Yes, it's gut reaction, and I'm afraid always has been. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it's exacerbated by the fact that Britain has, for a long time, had a kind of inferiority complex about its own cooking, and which has now disappeared. But there still exists a kind of I don't know how to explain it. There's a problem with being natural about food, of accepting it as an everyday thing. One's got to the point now where one's gone from kind of no food to too much food, from no mediation to vast amount of hyperbolic crap.
Gone from barbarism to
decadence
without going through civilization.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a very pithy way of putting it.
Well, I think that I found this sort of curious dichotomy. Because on the one hand, you are, in terms of architecture and town planning and so on, you're radical in your views, and you want this process. But in terms of food, you want things to actually get.
Yeah, but I mean, I think I don't know if radical's the right word, and I don't know if conservative's the right word. But I mean, I don't see why one can't. One should be a mess of contradictions, and I'm just trying to live up to that.
Well, Jonathan, whatever it is a constant delight, and whatever else comes in about you, you are a very well-rounded man. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. I don't know, well-rounded. All too well-rounded.